They laughed when she stepped up to the starting line in worn running shoes and oversized PT gear that looked like it came from a charity bin. No muscle definition. No intimidating presence, just a quiet woman with graying hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, while 200 Marines in peak physical condition lined up beside her for the annual base fitness challenge. The drill instructors exchanged knowing glances as if they already knew how this would end. One sergeant even muttered something about participation trophies, but when the stopwatch hit 0 and the dust settled, 26 minutes later, every single Marine on Raven Point Base stood in stunned silence watching this unassuming woman cross the finish line a full 3 minutes ahead of their fastest runner. Want to know who she really was and why her running time made hardened Marines question everything they thought they knew about speed and endurance? Hit subscribe and tell us in the comments what your personal best running time is. Let's dive into a story that will change how you think about judging athletes by their appearance. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The October morning at Raven Point Marine Corps Base cut through the North Carolina mountains with the kind of crisp bite that made breath visible and turned motivation into necessity. The annual Semper Fi challenge brought together every Marine stationed at the base, from fresh recruits still learning to tie their boots properly to seasoned staff sergeants who'd been running these hills since before some of the participants were born. It was more than just a fitness test. It was bragging rights, pride, and a chance to prove that age, rank, and reputation meant nothing when rubber met gravel on the 5-mile course that wound through the base perimeter and into the unforgiving terrain beyond the main gates. 237 Marines gathered at the starting line, their breath creating small clouds in the 40-degree air as they stretched, warmed up, and sized each other up with the competitive intensity that came naturally to people trained to excel under pressure. The favorites were obvious. Corporal Jake Brennan from Delta Company, who'd posted the fastest time last year and looked like he'd been carved from granite, Staff Sergeant Maria Delgado, whose marathon times qualified her for regional competitions, and Lieutenant Kyle Morrison, fresh from officer candidate school, with the kind of lean build that suggested he'd been born running. These were the names whispered in the chow hall. The ones Marines made quiet bets about, the specimens of human athletic achievement that made lesser runners grateful for participation medals. She arrived at O-6-40-5 exactly 15 minutes before race start, driving a faded blue Honda Civic that had seen better decades, and parking in the overflow lot where visiting family members usually left their cars. Nobody paid attention as she climbed out of the driver's seat, moving with the careful deliberation of someone whose joints protested morning cold. Her PT uniform hung loose in all the wrong places. Gray Marine Corps t-shirt that had been washed so many times the eagle, globe, and anchor logo was barely visible. Black running shorts that looked like they'd been borrowed from someone 2 sizes larger, and running shoes that had clearly logged thousands of miles on various terrains. Her graying brown hair was pulled back in a functional ponytail secured with what appeared to be a rubber band from a newspaper, and she carried herself with the unassuming presence of someone who'd long ago stopped trying to impress anyone. Registration table was manned by Gunnery Sergeant Rebecca Torres, a career Marine whose job was to verify eligibility and hand out race numbers. She looked up as the woman approached clipboard, ready for the usual routine name, rank, unit, assignment, but what she saw made her pause. This wasn't a Marine, at least not one she recognized, and definitely not someone who looked like they belonged at a competitive running event. "Ma'am, are you here for the family fun run?" Torres asked with practiced politeness. "That starts at 0100. After the main event, the woman shook her head and handed over a registration form that had been filled out in neat block letters. The name read Janet Holloway, and under unit assignment someone had written simply, "Observer status authorized by Colonel Davidson." Torres frowned as she scanned the paperwork. This was unusual. Observer Status was typically reserved for visiting officers or inspectors, not for middle-aged women who looked like they'd wandered over from the base. Commissary but the authorization signature was legitimate, and Colonel Davidson's name carried enough weight to settle most questions. Still, something felt off about the whole situation. "Ma'am, I need to see your military ID for verification," Torres said, maintaining her professional tone. Janet reached into a small fanny pack and produced a card that made Torres blink twice. "Retired Master Sergeant Janet Holloway, United States Marine Corps, 22 years of service, retirement date, stamped 6 months prior." The photograph showed the same face, just with shorter hair, and the sharp-eyed intensity that came with wearing the uniform for over 2 decades. "You're running the competitive division?" Torres asked, unable to keep the surprise out of her voice. The competitive division was 5 miles of punishing terrain, designed to test the limits of Marines in their physical prime, not a gentle jog for retirees looking to relive their glory days. Janet nodded once, a simple gesture that somehow carried more authority than most people managed with a full speech. "Colonel Davidson cleared me for full participation," she said, her voice carrying the kind of quiet confidence that suggested she wasn't asking permission, just stating facts. Torres handed over race number 238 and pointed toward the starting area where Marines were completing their final warm-up routines. As Janet pinned the number to her oversized shirt and began walking toward the starting line, whispers began to ripple through the crowd like stones thrown into still water. Who was the old lady? What was she doing here? Did someone's grandmother get lost on base? The comments weren't malicious, exactly just the natural curiosity of young athletes trying to understand why someone who looked like she belonged in a grocery store checkout line was preparing to run against Marines who trained for a living. Corporal Brennan stretched his hamstrings and glanced over with the kind of polite confusion reserved for situations that didn't quite make sense. "Think she knows what she signed up for?" he asked Staff Sergeant Delgado, who was adjusting her GPS watch with the precision of someone who tracked every split second of her training. Starting line stretched across the main road that led from the base toward the mountain training areas. Orange cones marked the boundaries, and a digital timer displayed 6 minutes until race start. Janet took her position near the back of the pack, not from strategy but from habit, the place where people who didn't belong usually tried to stay. Invisible, the Marines around her continued their pre-race rituals, dynamic stretching, visualization, breathing exercises that spoke to years of competitive training, while she simply stood quietly, hands at her sides, breathing normally, like someone waiting for a bus rather than preparing for a grueling test of physical endurance. The contrast was striking. 237 finely tuned athletic machines, and one woman who looked like she'd accidentally wandered into the wrong event entirely. But if Janet Holloway felt out of place or intimidated by the situation, nothing in her posture or expression suggested it. She waited with the same calm patience that had characterized every interaction since she'd arrived, as if she knew something the rest of them hadn't figured out yet. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The Semper Fi challenge course at Raven Point had earned its reputation through 2 decades of humbling even the most confident Marines who thought they understood what real endurance meant. The route began deceptively easy, a quarter mile of flat asphalt that lulled runners into believing they could maintain their opening pace. Then it turned sharply left toward the perimeter fence, where the real test began, a steady climb through dense pine forest on single track trails that had been carved by countless boots over the years. The North Carolina mountains didn't care about Marine Corps fitness standards. They imposed their own brutal requirements on anyone bold enough to challenge them. Morning fog still clung to the valleys between the ridgelines, creating an ethereal landscape where distant peaks appeared and disappeared like ghosts. The temperature hovered at 42 degrees, perfect for distance running. If you could handle the altitude changes that would spike heart rates and burn through oxygen faster than most people expected, the course Markers were military-precise red flags every quarter-mile, timing mats at strategic checkpoints, and water stations staffed by volunteers who'd learned to recognize the difference between normal fatigue and dangerous exhaustion. The elevation profile looked innocent on paper until you factored in the accumulated stress of climbing 1,500 feet over varied terrain while maintaining competitive pace. Base personnel had gathered along the starting area in clusters that reflected the unofficial hierarchy of military life. Senior NCOs stood near the command tent, sharing coffee and quiet predictions about which young Marines would learn humility. Before Mile 3, junior enlisted gathered around their squad leaders, talking trash with the bravado that came from not yet understanding their own limitations. Officers maintained their professional distance while secretly calculating whether their own PT scores would survive comparison to whatever times emerged from today's competition. The atmosphere carried that particular tension found only in military environments where pride, performance, and reputation intersected with unforgiving reality. Colonel Patricia Davidson stood on the elevated platform beside the timing equipment, her presence lending official weight to what might otherwise have been dismissed as just another base fitness event. She wore her dress blue uniform despite the early hour and outdoor setting because the Semper Fi challenge represented more than individual achievement. It was a demonstration of the fighting spirit that defined Marine culture. Her silver hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, and her ribbons told the story of 3 decades spent proving that Marines could accomplish impossible things through discipline and determination. She'd instituted this annual competition specifically to remind everyone that fitness wasn't just about meeting minimum standards. It was about discovering what happened when you pushed beyond the comfortable limits of ordinary effort. The starting line buzzed with nervous energy that veterans recognized as the moment before controlled chaos. Runners adjusted their gear, checked their watches, and engaged in the psychological warfare of pre-race posturing. Some Marines bounced on their toes, shadowboxing invisible opponents, while others stood perfectly still, conserving energy with the patience of predators waiting for prey. Conversations carried the mix of genuine camaraderie and subtle intimidation that defined competitive military culture. Stories about personal records, training routines, and strategic approaches to conquering the course. Each runner bringing their own interpretation of how to balance aggression with endurance over 5 miles of unforgiving terrain. Medical personnel had positioned themselves at 3 checkpoints along the route, their presence a reminder that the mountains didn't distinguish between Marines and civilians when it came to enforcing consequences for overconfidence or poor preparation. Corpsman Tyler Nash carried advanced life support equipment, not because they expected casualties, but because 2 years earlier, a lance corporal had pushed through heat exhaustion and required emergency evacuation from Mile 4. The base learned that day how quickly pride could become a medical emergency when combined with challenging terrain and competitive pressure. Now they took no chances with runner safety, even if it meant swallowing egos and accepting did not finish next to someone's name. Support vehicles idled at designated points along the course, their diesel engines adding a mechanical growl to the natural sounds of wind through pine needles and distant commands echoing from other training areas scattered across the base. The drivers were volunteers from motor transport Marines who understood that their role was part safety net, part witness to whatever drama would unfold when human determination met geographic reality. They'd seen everything over the years, from spectacular collapses to miraculous comebacks, and they knew that the most interesting stories usually involved the runners. Nobody expected to be factors when the final times were posted. Weather conditions couldn't have been better for distance running if someone had special ordered them from nature itself. The morning sun filtered through tree branches at angles that suggested autumn was settling into the mountains for a long stay. Humidity levels remained low enough to prevent the sweat-soaked misery that characterized summer training in North Carolina, and the steady breeze carried the scent of pine needles and damp earth that reminded everyone why they'd chosen to serve in places where natural beauty could coexist with military precision. The kind of morning that made even the most cynical Marines admit that their job occasionally provided moments of unexpected grace. 238 runners, stretched, warmed up, and mentally prepared for a challenge that would separate genuine fitness from mere appearance, while around them the base continued its normal operations with the practiced efficiency of an organization that never stopped training for scenarios where physical conditioning meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. The Semper Fi challenge represented just one more opportunity to discover who possessed the internal drive necessary to excel when comfort zones became distant memories, and the only choice was to keep moving forward regardless of what the mountains demanded in return. Janet moved through her pre-race routine with the methodical precision of someone who'd learned that preparation mattered more than appearance or fanfare, while 200 Marines around her engaged in elaborate warm-up rituals. She simply walked the perimeter of the starting area, taking measured steps that seemed more like a casual stroll than athletic preparation. Her movements carried none of the dynamic energy that characterized serious runners. No high knees or butt kicks, no explosive jumps or aggressive stretching sequences. Just quiet, deliberate motion that suggested she understood her body well enough to know exactly what it needed and what it didn't. Contrast between Janet and her fellow competitors became more pronounced as racetime approached, where others shadowboxed invisible opponents or performed complex mobility sequences. She stood with hands clasped behind her back, observing the course markers with the kind of attention most people reserved for reading important documents. Her breathing remained steady and controlled while conversations buzzed around her about split times, training volumes, and strategic approaches to conquering the mountain terrain. She listened without participating, absorbing information with the patience of someone who'd learned that other people's strategies often revealed more about their weaknesses than their strengths. Her appearance drew curious glances from Marines who couldn't quite categorize what they were seeing. The oversized PT gear hung on her frame like clothing borrowed from someone else's closet. The faded gray t-shirt had been washed so many times that the fabric felt soft as flannel, and the running shorts reached nearly to her knees in a style that suggested function over form. Her running shoes showed extensive wear patterns on the sawless, evidence of thousands of miles logged on various surfaces, but they weren't the latest high-tech models favored by serious athletes, just sturdy, reliable footwear that had proven itself through consistent use rather than marketing campaigns. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez from Weapons Company found himself watching Janet with growing curiosity as she completed what appeared to be the world's most casual pre-race preparation. He'd been running competitively since high school and understood the rituals that serious athletes employed to prepare their bodies and minds for demanding challenges. But this woman seemed to operate by entirely different rules. Her movements suggested someone comfortable in her own skin, despite being surrounded by people half her age who radiated the aggressive confidence of peak physical conditioning. First time at one of these events? Rodriguez asked, approaching with the friendly curiosity that came naturally to Marines who'd learned to read people quickly. Janet turned toward him with a slight smile that reached her eyes and conveyed warmth without revealing anything about what she might be thinking. Something like that, she replied, her voice carrying the kind of neutral tone that answered the question without providing useful information. Rodriguez waited for elaboration that didn't come and found himself uncertain how to continue the conversation with someone who seemed perfectly comfortable with silence. Most Marines he knew filled quiet moments with chatter about training philosophy, personal records, or predictions about how the competition would unfold. But Janet simply waited, as if she had all the time in the world and no need to justify her presence to anyone. Lieutenant Morrison jogged past her in his final warm-up loop and noticed the odd tableau of Rodriguez attempting conversation with the mysterious older woman who'd somehow gained entry to their exclusive athletic event. His curiosity got the better of his judgment, and he slowed to a walk as he approached close enough to overhear Whatever explanation might emerge about how someone's grandmother had ended up registered for the most challenging fitness competition on base. "Ma'am, are you sure you're signed up for the right event?" Morrison asked with the kind of polite concern that officers learn to employ when dealing with situations that didn't quite make sense. "The family fun run doesn't start until after we finish, and it's only 2 miles mostly flat terrain. Much more manageable for casual participants." Janet's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind her eyes, a subtle hardening that suggested she'd heard variations of this question before and hadn't appreciated it any more than she did now. "I'm exactly where I need to be, Lieutenant," she said with quiet authority that somehow made Morrison feel like he'd just been gently corrected by someone who outranked him, despite wearing no insignia of rank or status. The exchange drew attention from nearby Marines, who sensed drama developing in the way that military personnel always seem to detect when unofficial entertainment was about to begin. Corporal Williams from Alpha Company nudged his running partner and nodded toward the small group surrounding Janet. Their conversation had taken on the quality of theater, with supporting actors who weren't sure of their roles, but understood they were witnessing something worth remembering. "Maybe she's someone's wife trying to prove a point," Williams whispered to his buddy while pretending to adjust his shoelaces. "You know how dependents sometimes get competitive about fitness challenges. My cousin's wife tried to run with his unit once and made it about half a mile before she had to call for pickup." The speculation rippled outward through the crowd as Marines shared theories about Janet's presence and motivations. Some suggested she might be a former athlete attempting a comeback. Others proposed she was conducting research for a fitness program aimed at older military dependents. A few wondered if this was some kind of publicity stunt designed to promote inclusivity in base recreational activities. But none of the theories adequately explained the quiet confidence she projected, or the way she seemed completely unbothered by the attention and skepticism surrounding her participation. Gunnery Sergeant Torres approached with Janet's timing chip and race packet, trying to maintain professional neutrality while privately wondering if she should have insisted on additional verification before allowing this registration to proceed. The paperwork was legitimate, and Colonel Davidson's authorization was clear, but something about the entire situation felt unusual in ways that experience hadn't prepared her to handle. "Ma'am, you'll need to activate your timing chip at the starting line," Torres explained while handing over the electronic device that would track Janet's progress through the course checkpoints. "The chip records your splits automatically, so you don't need to worry about manual timing. Just make sure it's securely attached to your shoe and positioned where it won't get damaged by trail debris." Janet accepted the equipment with practiced efficiency, suggesting she understood race technology better than her appearance might have indicated. She attached the chip to her left shoe with movements that spoke to familiarity with competitive events, even if her current gear suggested otherwise. The small crowd of observers began to disperse as race start approached, but several Marines made mental notes to watch for. Number 238. During the early miles when the field would spread out according to ability levels, Colonel Davidson's voice crackled through the public address system as she began the pre-race briefing, reminding participants about safety protocols, course boundaries, and the importance of maintaining Marine Corps standards even in competitive situations. Her words carried the weight of command authority, but also reflected genuine concern for the welfare of Marines who would be pushing their physical limits on challenging terrain that had humbled better athletes than most of those gathered at the starting line. "Today's event represents an opportunity to test yourselves against standards that matter," the colonel announced, her voice carrying clearly across the assembly area. "Physical fitness remains a cornerstone of military readiness, and personal character completion times are secondary to the demonstration of Marine Corps values, including integrity, courage, and commitment to excellence regardless of individual circumstances or expectations." Janet listened to the briefing with the same quiet attention she'd given to everything else that morning, absorbing information without visible reaction while around her Marines. made final adjustments to their gear, and engaged in last-minute psychological preparation for what promised to be a demanding test of endurance and determination. Her presence had become part of the pre-race atmosphere, even if nobody quite understood what role she was meant to play in the drama that was about to unfold across 5 miles of unforgiving mountain terrain. Murmurs of concern reached a crescendo as Marines began positioning themselves according to their expected finishing times, with faster runners claiming spots near the front of the pack and recreational participants settling toward the middle and rear sections. Janet's presence at the starting line created an awkward disruption to this self-organizing system, as nobody quite knew how to categorize her abilities or where she belonged in the competitive hierarchy that had emerged naturally through years of base fitness events. Her position near the back suggested either humility or realism, but her calm demeanor hinted at something else entirely. Sergeant First Class Michael Thorne from the Physical Training Division had been observing the pre-race dynamics with growing unease as the Marine responsible for coordinating fitness events and maintaining safety standards. He felt obligated to address situations that might result in injuries, embarrassment, or worse. His 22 years of military service had taught him to recognize when someone was about to attempt something beyond their capabilities. And everything about Janet Holloway suggested she was walking into a scenario that would end poorly for everyone involved. "Ma'am, I need to speak with you privately," Thorne said, approaching Janet with the kind of serious expression that Marines recognized as precursor to difficult conversations. He gestured toward a quiet area away from the main crowd, where they could discuss his concerns without creating a public spectacle that might embarrass her or undermine the event's professional atmosphere. Janet followed without resistance, but her expression remained neutral, as if she'd been expecting this conversation since the moment she'd arrived at the base. "Look, I don't know what your connection is to Colonel Davidson or why you received authorization to participate, but I have to ask if you fully understand what you're getting into here." Thorne began, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone trying to be helpful rather than confrontational. "This isn't a charity run or a family fitness event. We're talking about 5 miles of mountain terrain that challenges Marines in peak physical condition every year. We have participants who train for months and still struggle to finish without requiring medical attention." Janet listened without interrupting while Thorne outlined his concerns about her age, her apparent lack of competitive running experience, and the liability issues that could arise if something went wrong during the event. His arguments were logical and delivered with genuine concern for her welfare, but she noticed that his reasoning was based entirely on assumptions about her capabilities, drawn from visual evidence that told only part of her story. "Sergeant, I appreciate your concern, but I'm confident in my preparation," Janet replied, her voice remaining calm despite the clear implication that she was making a mistake. "I understand the course requirements, and I've taken appropriate precautions to ensure my safety throughout the event." Thorne's frustration began to show as he realized that polite suggestions weren't going to deter her from what he viewed as a potentially dangerous decision. "Ma'am, with all due respect, confidence isn't the same as capability. We've had Marines half your age require evacuation from this course when they overestimated their fitness levels. I don't want to see you become a statistic or create a situation where medical resources have to be diverted from other participants who might need emergency assistance." The conversation had attracted attention from nearby Marines who pretended to focus on their warm-up routines, while obviously listening to what had become an uncomfortable negotiation between institutional responsibility and individual determination. Lieutenant Morrison found himself caught between sympathy for Thorne's position and admiration for Janet's refusal to be intimidated by official pressure, even though he privately agreed that she was probably making a serious error in judgment. "Perhaps we could arrange for you to participate in a modified version," Thorne suggested, trying a different approach. "There's a 2-mile loop that covers some of the same terrain but eliminates the most challenging elevation changes. You'd still get the Experience of running with the group, but without exposing yourself to unnecessary risk. The timing would be unofficial, but you'd have proof of participation for whatever personal goals you're trying to achieve. Janet's response was immediate and delivered with quiet finality. Sergeant, I didn't register for a modified experience. I signed up for the same challenge facing every other participant, and I intend to complete it according to the established course parameters. The exchange had reached an impasse that Thorne recognized from years of dealing with stubborn Marines who refused to acknowledge their limitations. His duty required him to prevent foreseeable problems, but his authority had limits when dealing with someone who possessed legitimate authorization from base command. The situation was further complicated by the growing crowd of spectators who were beginning to view this as entertainment rather than a safety discussion. Staff Sergeant Delgado stepped forward. With the diplomatic skills that had made her successful in managing diverse groups of Marines with competing egos and agendas. Ma'am, maybe we could pair you with an experienced runner who could provide guidance during the early miles, she suggested, trying to find middle ground that addressed safety concerns while respecting Janet's determination to participate. Someone who knows the course well and could help pace you through the challenging sections. That won't be necessary, Janet replied, her tone suggesting that further negotiations would be pointless. I prefer to run independently, and I'm comfortable with the consequences of my decisions, whether positive or negative. Corporal Brennan, who had been listening with growing amazement at Janet's stubborn resistance to common sense, finally decided to voice what several Marines were thinking. Ma'am, no disrespect intended, but do you have any idea what the course record is for this event? He asked with the kind of aggressive curiosity that characterized competitive athletes. The fastest time ever posted was 24 minutes and 37 seconds by a Marine who trained specifically for mountain running and had been preparing for 6 months. Janet acknowledged his question with a slight nod, but offered no response about her own expectations or training background, which only increased the sense that she was either remarkably naive about the challenge ahead or operating with information that nobody else possessed. Her silence on the subject of personal goals or realistic finishing times suggested either supreme confidence or complete lack of understanding about competitive distance running. Most first-time participants finish between 35 and 40 minutes if they complete the course at all. Brennan continued, hoping that specific data might penetrate whatever psychological barrier was preventing her from recognizing the magnitude of her tactical error. About 15% require assistance during the final 2 miles, and approximately 8% don't finish due to exhaustion, injury, or equipment failure. Those statistics represent young Marines in excellent physical condition. The mathematical reality of Janet's situation was becoming clear to everyone, except apparently Janet herself, who maintained her calm composure, despite being presented with evidence that suggested her participation would likely end in failure, embarrassment, or worse. Thorne made one final attempt to convince her to reconsider her decision, using the kind of direct language that Marines understood when subtle approaches failed to produce desired results. Ma'am, I'm going to be frank with you because sugarcoating the situation isn't helping anyone here. He said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd seen enough preventable accidents to take safety seriously. Based on observable evidence, you don't appear to have the physical conditioning necessary to complete this course safely. Your participation creates liability issues for base command and resource allocation problems for medical personnel who might need to respond when you require assistance. Janet met his gaze directly and spoke with quiet conviction that somehow carried more authority than his raised voice and official position. Sergeant, I understand your concerns, and I respect your responsibility for participant safety. But I'm going to run this course today as registered. You'll have your answer about my capabilities in approximately 30 minutes when the race results are posted. The finality in her voice made it clear that further discussion would be pointless, and Thorne found himself in the uncomfortable position of accepting responsibility for a situation he couldn't control while hoping that his professional reputation wouldn't suffer when Janet's inevitable failure became part of the official record of an event that was supposed to showcase Marine Corps' excellence rather than poor judgment and wishful thinking. As the tension from Sergeant Thorne's intervention began to dissipate, Marines returned to their final preparations with the kind of nervous energy that preceded competitive events where reputations and bragging rights hung in the balance. Janet moved away from the confrontation with the same measured pace she'd maintained throughout the morning, but her route back toward the starting line took her past the equipment check station where race officials verified that participants weren't carrying prohibited items or gear that might provide unfair advantages. Corpsman Nash was conducting routine inspections of hydration packs and GPS watches when Janet approached with her small fanny pack for the mandatory security check. The process was typically perfunctory since most Marines carried standard issue equipment that had been approved through previous events, but protocol required examination of all personal items to ensure compliance with competition regulations. Nash opened the pack expecting to find the usual collection of energy gels, identification, and emergency contact information. Instead, he discovered something that made him pause and look more carefully at the woman standing patiently before him. Nestled between a folded $20 bill and what appeared to be prescription medication was a laminated card that had seen considerable wear on the edges. The plastic coating was cracked in several places, and the text had faded from years of exposure to sweat and friction, but the information remained legible enough to read Marine Corps' Marathon Official Finisher Certificate, and below that, in smaller print, Janet M. Holloway, time 2 hours 57 minutes 43 seconds, Nash Day. Blinked and read the certificate again to make sure he hadn't misunderstood. What he was seeing, a sub-3-hour marathon time, represented elite-level performance that placed finishers in the top 5% of all participants, regardless of age or gender. The Marine Corps' marathon was notorious for its challenging course and competitive field, drawing serious runners from military and civilian backgrounds, who trained for years to achieve times that most recreational athletes could only dream about achieving. "Man, this is your marathon certificate?" Nash asked, trying to keep his voice neutral while processing the implications of what he'd discovered. Janet nodded once, but offered no elaboration about when or how she'd achieved a finishing time that would have been impressive for someone half her age, let alone a woman who appeared to be approaching 60 years old with no visible signs of the muscle definition that characterized distance running specialists. The certificate was dated 18 months earlier, which meant Janet had posted this performance relatively recently rather than decades ago, when she might have been in peak athletic condition. Nash found himself studying her appearance more carefully, looking for signs he might have missed that would explain how someone who looked like a casual fitness enthusiast had managed to run 26.2 miles at a pace that averaged just under 7 minutes per mile. "That's quite an achievement," Nash said carefully while returning the certificate to her pack. The Marine Corps' marathon has a reputation for being particularly demanding compared to civilian events. The hills around Quantico eliminate a lot of people who come in thinking they're prepared for the challenge. Janet accepted the compliment with a slight smile but maintained the same enigmatic silence that had characterized all her interactions since arriving at the base. Nash wanted to ask about her training background, her running history, and how she'd developed the speed necessary to achieve such an impressive time, but something in her demeanor suggested that direct questions would be met with the same polite deflection she'd employed with everyone else who'd tried to understand her presence at the event. Word of Nash's discovery began to spread through the medical station staff in the way that interesting information always traveled through military communities. Petty Officer Second Class Williams overheard the conversation and immediately began calculating the implications of a sub-3-hour marathon time for someone planning to run a 5-mile mountain course that most Marines completed in 35 to 40 minutes if Janet could maintain even a fraction of her marathon pace over shorter distances. She might surprise everyone who dismissed her as an overconfident amateur. Did you verify that certificate is legitimate? Williams asked Nash quietly while pretending to organize medical supplies. Sometimes people create fake documentation to impress others or gain access to events they're not qualified for, especially when there's prize money or recognition involved. Nash had considered the same possibility, but the certificate showed signs of authentic wear that would be difficult to replicate. The lamination was cracked in patterns consistent with years of being carried in wallets or gear bags, and the printing quality matched other official Marine Corps documents he'd seen throughout his military career. More importantly, the timing chip database would verify her identity and previous race results if anyone chose to investigate her claims. Lieutenant Morrison had been stretching nearby when fragments of the conversation reached his ears and found himself drawn into the growing cluster of personnel who were trying to understand what they'd discovered about Janet's background. A marathon time that fast suggested serious athletic ability that contradicted everything they'd observed about her preparation and appearance, creating cognitive dissonance that none of them quite knew how to resolve. Maybe she was a competitive runner before retiring from the Marines. Morrison suggested trying to reconcile the evidence with his assumptions about age and athletic decline. Sometimes former athletes maintain their speed longer than you'd expect, especially if they've been training consistently throughout their careers. But even that explanation felt inadequate when applied to someone who looked like she'd borrowed her running gear from a thrift store and showed no signs of the obsessive attention to equipment and technique that characterized serious distance runners. Morrison had trained with collegiate athletes who spent thousands of dollars on shoes alone and followed nutrition protocols that bordered on religious devotion. Yet Janet carried herself with the casual indifference of someone who viewed running as transportation rather than competition. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, who had attempted conversation with Janet earlier, found himself reconsidering their brief exchange in light of this new information. Her responses had seemed evasive at the time, but now they suggested someone who possessed knowledge and experience that she simply chose not to share with strangers who hadn't earned her trust or demonstrated understanding of what she'd accomplished. Discovery created ripples of uncertainty throughout the starting area as Marines began questioning their initial assessments of Janet's capabilities while still struggling to reconcile her appearance with evidence of elite athletic performance. Some participants started wondering if they'd underestimated not just her potential, but their own assumptions about what serious runners looked like when they weren't wearing sponsored gear or displaying obvious signs of professional training gunnery. Sergeant Torres received word of the marathon certificate through the informal communication network that connected all base personnel involved in event coordination. Her initial reaction was skepticism, followed by curiosity about why someone with legitimate athletic credentials would allow herself to be dismissed and questioned rather than simply producing evidence of her qualifications. When challenged by Sergeant Thorne, "We might have a situation developing here," Torres mentioned to her assistant while watching Janet complete her equipment check with the same calm efficiency she'd shown throughout the morning. Either we're dealing with someone who has been seriously underestimated, or we're about to witness what happens when past performance doesn't translate to current capability. The timing of this discovery created additional complexity, since race start was scheduled in less than 10 minutes, leaving insufficient time for thorough investigation or verification of Janet's background through official channels. Participants were already moving toward their starting positions, and any delay would disrupt the carefully planned schedule that coordinated with other base activities throughout the morning. Colonel Davidson's voice announced the 5-minute warning over the public address system, reminding participants to complete final preparations and move to their designated starting positions based on expected finishing times. Janet gathered her minimal gear and began walking toward the back of the pack where she'd positioned herself. earlier apparently unchanged by the discovery that she possessed credentials that might justify a more aggressive starting strategy. The revelation of her marathon certificate had created more questions than answers, leaving observers uncertain whether they were about to witness an impressive athletic performance or learn that previous achievements didn't guarantee current capability, regardless of what happened over the next 30 minutes. Janet Holloway had already succeeded in challenging everyone's assumptions about the relationship between appearance and ability even before the race officially began, despite the growing whispers about Janet's marathon certificate circulating through the medical station and equipment check area. The prevailing sentiment among the competitive runners remained unchanged. If anything, the discovery seemed to strengthen their conviction that she was either living in the past or operating under dangerous delusions about her current capabilities. Corporal Brennan, who had established himself as the unofficial spokesman for skepticism, doubled down on his assessment when Lieutenant Morrison approached him with news of the sub-3-hour marathon time. "A piece of paper doesn't mean anything today," Brennan declared while adjusting his GPS watch with the precision of someone who tracked every metric of his training. "I've seen plenty of former athletes who cling to old achievements when their bodies can't cash the checks their egos are writing. Marathon running and mountain trail running are completely different animals, requiring different muscle groups, different energy systems, and different mental approaches." His confidence was infectious, spreading through the group of front runners who had gathered near the starting line to discuss race strategy and mentally prepare for what they expected to be a straightforward competition among themselves, with Janet representing little more than an interesting footnote about the dangers of overconfidence in aging athletes. Morrison found himself caught between the evidence he'd heard about and the visual reality of Janet's appearance, which seemed to support Brennan's dismissive analysis. "Besides," added Staff Sergeant Delgado, while performing dynamic stretches that showcased her impressive range of motion, "even if that certificate is legitimate and recent, it doesn't account for the specific demands of our course. Terrain makes a huge difference in performance outcomes. I've seen Boston Marathon qualifiers struggle to break 30 minutes on this route because they trained on flat roads and couldn't adapt to sustained climbing." The rationalization process had begun in earnest, as Marines who prided themselves on superior fitness and competitive achievement worked to maintain their worldview in the face of contradictory evidence, rather than acknowledge that they might have misjudged Janet's capabilities. They constructed increasingly elaborate explanations for why her documented performance was irrelevant to current circumstances. Sergeant First Class Harrison from Bravo Company offered his own theory based on years of observing military fitness culture. "Marathon times can be deceiving, especially for older participants who might have received age group awards or achieved personal records that look impressive on paper but don't translate to competitive performance against younger athletes in peak condition." We're talking about Marines who train specifically for events like this versus someone who might have lucked into one good race 18 months ago. The conversation had attracted attention from other participants who were eager to maintain their confidence in the established pecking order that would determine bragging rights for the next year. Nobody wanted to consider that their careful preparation and competitive analysis might be undermined by an unassuming woman who had absorbed their dismissive comments with quiet dignity while possessing credentials that suggested she belonged in an entirely different category of athlete. Lieutenant Morrison attempted to inject some uncertainty into the group's collective certainty. "Maybe we should consider that appearances can be deceiving," he suggested while privately wondering if his own training had been adequate preparation for competing against someone with documented elite performance. A sub-3-hour marathon requires maintaining a 6:50 pace for over 26 miles, which suggests serious aerobic capacity and mental toughness. His comment was met with the kind of polite skepticism that Marines employed when a junior officer offered opinions that contradicted the wisdom of senior enlisted personnel who had more experience in practical matters. Corporal Williams from Alpha Company provided what the group considered definitive analysis based on observable evidence, rather than speculation about hidden capabilities. Look at her gear, look at her preparation, look at her body language, William said, gesturing toward Janet, who was standing quietly near the back of the starting area. Everything about her presentation suggests someone who doesn't understand what she's gotten herself into serious distance. Runners are obsessive about equipment, nutrition, pacing, strategy, and course reconnaissance. She's treating this like a casual jog around the neighborhood. The group murmured agreement as they cataloged the visual evidence that supported their assessment. Janet's oversized clothing suggested someone who either didn't own proper athletic wear or didn't understand its importance for performance. Her minimal pre-race routine indicated unfamiliarity with competitive protocols, and her positioning at the back of the pack demonstrated either excessive humility or realistic acknowledgement of her limitations. Staff Sergeant Delgado added authoritative weight to the analysis. In my experience, athletes who achieve legitimate elite times develop specific habits and mindsets that become second nature. You can identify serious runners from across a parking lot by how they move, how they prepare, and how they interact with competition. This woman displays none of those characteristics. The discussion was interrupted by Sergeant Thorne, who had overheard portions of the conversation and felt obligated to provide additional context about his earlier intervention with Janet. His professional reputation was at stake if she experienced problems during the race, so he was motivated to ensure that other participants understood the safety concerns that had prompted his unsuccessful attempt to dissuade her from participating. Spent 15 minutes trying to convince her to accept a modified course or pair with an experienced guide, Thorne explained. To the assembled group, her responses suggested either supreme confidence or complete lack of understanding about the challenges ahead. When someone refuses reasonable safety precautions, it usually indicates poor judgment rather than hidden expertise. His assessment carried significant weight with Marines who respected his years of experience in coordinating fitness events and managing risk factors associated with competitive activities. Thorne had seen enough preventable injuries and embarrassing failures to recognize the warning signs that preceded problems, and everything about Janet's presentation triggered his professional instincts about participants who were likely to require assistance. Corporal Brennan seized on this additional evidence to reinforce his position. There you have it from someone whose job is evaluating participant readiness. She refused professional guidance and safety recommendations, which tells you everything you need to know about her decision-making process. Serious athletes welcome expert advice even when they're confident in their abilities. The final minutes before race start were filled with increasingly confident predictions about Janet's likely performance as the competitive runners convinced themselves that their initial assessment had been correct. Despite the troubling evidence of her marathon certificate, they constructed a narrative that preserved their understanding of athletic hierarchy while explaining away information that didn't fit their expectations. Lieutenant Morrison found himself nodding along with the group consensus while privately harboring doubts that he couldn't quite articulate. Something about Janet's calm composure and quiet confidence suggested depths that weren't immediately apparent, but peer pressure and the comfort of shared certainty made it easier to accept the collective wisdom rather than trust his instincts about what he might be missing. Colonel Davidson's voice crackled through the speakers announcing the final 30-second countdown as Marines took their positions according to expected finishing times and personal race strategies. The front runners settled into their aggressive starting stances while middle pack participants focused on pacing strategies that would carry them through the challenging middle miles. Janet remained at the back of the field, apparently unconcerned about positioning for tactical advantage. This is going to be educational for everyone involved, Brennan muttered to his nearby competitors as they prepared for the starting signal. Sometimes reality provides the best lessons about the difference between wishful thinking and actual capability. We'll know everything we need to know about her Fitness level by mile 2 when the real climbing begins. The electronic timing system activated with its distinctive beep signaling. The official start of the Semper Fi challenge as 238 Marines began their assault on 5 miles of mountain terrain that would test every assumption they'd made about themselves and each other. Captain Sarah Chun had arrived at Raven Point, Marine Corps' base, only 3 weeks earlier as part of a temporary assignment to evaluate training programs across multiple installations, but her background in competitive athletics and exercise physiology made her uniquely qualified to recognize what others were missing about Janet Holloway. She stood apart from the crowd of Marines preparing for the Semper Fi challenge, not because she lacked interest in the competition, but because her trained eye was detecting patterns that contradicted the prevailing narrative about the mysterious older woman who had somehow gained entry to their exclusive event. Unlike the other observers, Chen possessed credentials that extended far beyond military rank. Her doctorate in sports science from Stanford had been earned through years of studying elite athletic performance and the physiological markers that distinguished truly exceptional athletes from recreational enthusiasts. Her civilian career before joining the Marines had included consulting work with Olympic training centers, where she learned to identify talent and potential in ways that went deeper than superficial observation. As Chun watched Janet move through her minimal pre-race routine, she noticed details that the other Marines were either missing or misinterpreting. The economy of motion that characterized Janet's movements suggested someone who understood her body with the precision that came from decades of serious training. Her breathing patterns remained steady and controlled despite the surrounding chaos, indicating cardiovascular conditioning that couldn't be faked or simulated through casual fitness activities. Interesting choice of starting position, Chun murmured to herself while observing Janet's decision to line up near the back of the pack among recreational participants, rather than positioning herself according to her documented marathon capabilities. Most competitive runners were aggressive about starting placement because early positioning could determine race outcomes on crowded courses, but Janet seemed unconcerned about tactical disadvantages that would matter to someone focused on winning rather than simply participating. Chun's attention was drawn to subtle biomechanical indicators that revealed more about Janet's true condition than her clothing or equipment choices. The slight forward lean in her posture suggested someone accustomed to sustained forward motion, while the relaxed positioning of her shoulders indicated efficient running form that had been developed through extensive training. Her foot placement and weight distribution spoke to someone who understood how to minimize energy expenditure over long distances. Kevin Walsh approached Chun with the casual friendliness that characterized interactions between officers who shared similar professional backgrounds. "What do you make of our mystery participant?" he asked, nodding toward Janet while maintaining the kind of respectful distance that avoided appearing to gossip about fellow service members. "Sergeant Thorne seems convinced she's about to learn some hard lessons about overestimating personal fitness levels." Chun considered her response carefully because her professional assessment contradicted the popular opinion that had developed among the other Marines. "I think there might be more to her story than what's immediately apparent," she said diplomatically while continuing to observe Janet's pre-race behavior. "Some of the most accomplished athletes I've worked with were masters of managing expectations and conserving energy for when it mattered most." Walsh followed Chun's gaze, trying to see whatever details she was noticing that had escaped his attention. "You think she's actually competitive?" he asked with genuine curiosity rather than skepticism, because, based on observable evidence, most people would conclude that she's either overconfident or misinformed about what she's attempting to accomplish today. Physical appearance can be deceiving, especially among endurance athletes who prioritize function over form, Chun explained while watching Janet complete what appeared to be a casual dynamic warm-up that actually incorporated elements of advanced movement preparation. "Some of the fastest distance runners I've encountered looked more like librarians than athletes until they started moving at race pace." The conversation was overheard by Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, who had been struggling to reconcile his earlier interaction with Janet against the collective wisdom of his peers about her likely performance. "Captain, are you suggesting that we might have misjudged her capabilities?" he asked with the kind of careful tone that Marines used when questioning the opinions of senior officers. Appreciated Rodriguez's directness because it gave her an opportunity to share observations that might help others understand what they were witnessing. "I'm suggesting that elite athletic performance doesn't always present itself in ways that casual observers expect," she replied, while noting how Janet's breathing remained completely steady despite the morning cold that was causing visible exertion among other participants. "Look at her respiratory rate and depth." Chun continued, using her knowledge to point out details that others might miss. "Those patterns suggest someone with exceptional aerobic capacity, which takes years to develop through consistent high-level training. You can't fake the kind of efficient oxygen processing that allows someone to remain calm and controlled in competitive environments." Major Walsh found himself studying Janet with renewed interest as Chen highlighted biomechanical indicators that had been invisible to his untrained observation. "What else should we be looking for?" he asked with the intellectual curiosity that had made him successful in his military career. "If there are signs that suggest serious athletic background, we should probably adjust our expectations about how this competition might unfold." Chun pointed out Janet's foot positioning and stride mechanics during her brief movement preparation. "Notice how she naturally lands on her midfoot rather than heel striking, which indicates running form that's been refined through extensive training. Most recreational runners display obvious inefficiencies in their movement patterns, but she's demonstrating textbook biomechanics even during casual walking." The analysis was interrupted by the arrival of Gunnery Sergeant Torres, who had been coordinating with medical personnel about participant safety protocols and had overheard portions of Chun's assessment. "Captain, should we be concerned about our safety preparations if we've significantly underestimated one of the participants?" Torres asked with the practical mindset that characterized senior enlisted personnel. "I don't think safety is the issue," Chun replied while continuing to observe Janet's behavior patterns. "If anything, someone with legitimate elite training is likely to be more aware of their limitations and better prepared for the physical demands they're about to face. The concern would be if other participants have made strategic decisions based on incorrect assumptions about the competitive field." Rodriguez processed this information while reconsidering his earlier conversation with Janet and her enigmatic responses to direct questions about her background. "She was pretty evasive when I tried to engage her in typical pre-race discussion," he admitted, but maybe that was humility rather than uncertainty about what she was getting into. Chun nodded as she recognized behavior patterns that were common among accomplished athletes who had learned to manage expectations and avoid psychological warfare that could complicate their competitive focus. Elite performers often prefer to let their results speak rather than engaging in pre-race posturing or detailed explanations of their qualifications. It's actually a sign of maturity and confidence in most cases. The 5-minute warning announcement from Colonel Davidson prompted final positioning among participants as Marines moved toward their intended starting locations based on expected finishing times and race strategy. Chun watched with professional interest as Janet remained in her chosen position despite having multiple opportunities to move forward among faster participants. "That's either supreme confidence or careful race management," Chun observed to the small group that had gathered around her impromptu analysis session. Starting conservatively allows someone to control their early pace and avoid getting pulled into aggressive racing that might compromise their ability to finish. Strong positioning for tactical advantage only matters if you're racing for placement rather than personal achievement. Major Walsh checked his stopwatch and prepared to move toward the official observation area, where base leadership would monitor race progress through radio communications with checkpoint personnel. "Captain, your assessment has certainly given us something To think about, he said with genuine appreciation for Chun's expertise. I suspect we're about to learn whether academic analysis translates to practical reality on mountain terrain. Chun smiled as she gathered her own observation equipment, including binoculars and timing devices that would allow her to track participant progress through various segments of the course. That's what makes competitive athletics fascinating, she replied. The intersection between theoretical knowledge and human performance under pressure often produces results that surprise everyone involved, including the athletes themselves. As the final seconds counted down toward race start, Chun positioned herself for optimal observation of the early race dynamics, while privately hoping that her professional assessment would prove accurate rather than representing wishful thinking about an underdog story that appealed to her sense of competitive drama. The electronic starting beep echoed across Raven Point's mountain terrain as 238 Marines surged forward in the controlled chaos that characterized mass start events. The front runners immediately established an aggressive pace that would separate the competitive field from recreational participants within the first quarter mile, while middle pack runners settled into sustainable rhythms designed to carry them through 5 miles of challenging elevation changes. Janet maintained her position near the back of the field, moving with the same measured efficiency she displayed throughout the morning. Initial flat section allowed for natural sorting as participants found their appropriate pace groups and positioned themselves according to their fitness levels and race strategies. Corporal Brennan and Staff Sergeant Delgado quickly established themselves at the front of the competitive pack, along with Lieutenant Morrison and several other Marines who had trained specifically for this event. Their early pace was aggressive, but sustainable, reflecting months of preparation for the demanding course that lay ahead. By the half-mile mark, as the route began its first significant climb into the pine forest, the field had stretched into distinct groups separated by ability and tactical approach. The lead pack of 15 runners maintained visual contact with each other, while the main body of participants spread across several hundred yards behind them. Janet had gradually moved forward through the recreational field, not by increasing her pace but by maintaining consistent effort, while others began to slow in response to the changing terrain. Captain Chun observed the early race dynamics through binoculars from her position near the first checkpoint, noting how different participants responded to the transition from flat asphalt to climbing single-track trail. Interesting pacing strategy, she murmured while tracking Janet's progress relative to other runners. She's not racing the field, she's racing the course itself, which suggests someone who understands energy management over distance. The first checkpoint radio report crackled through to the command station, where Colonel Davidson monitored race progress with the attention that base commanders applied to all events that reflected on Marine Corps standards. Lead pack through checkpoint 1 at 4 minutes 18 seconds. The voice reported main field spread over 2 minutes with normal distribution. No medical incidents reported. All participants maintaining forward progress. What the radio report didn't capture was the subtle drama unfolding in the middle sections of the field, where Janet had continued her steady advance through the recreational participants without apparent increase in effort. Her breathing remained controlled, and her stride maintained the same efficient rhythm that had characterized her movement since the starting line, while around her other Marines began showing signs of exertion as the climbing intensified. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez found himself running alongside Janet during the approach to Checkpoint 2, having been gradually overtaken as she moved through the field with relentless consistency. His own pace felt sustainable for the early miles, but he was beginning to question whether his training had adequately prepared him for maintaining current effort levels through the more challenging terrain that lay ahead. Janet's presence beside him created cognitive dissonance, as her effortless movement contradicted everything he'd assumed about her fitness level. "How are you feeling?" Rodriguez asked between controlled breaths, hoping to gain insight into her strategy or confirm that she was pushing beyond sustainable limits. Despite her calm appearance, Janet glanced toward him with a slight smile that revealed nothing about her internal state. "Fine, thank you," she replied without any indication that the climbing was affecting her differently than the flat opening. Section. The conversation was brief because Rodriguez found himself falling behind as Janet maintained her steady rhythm up the steepest section of the first major climb. Her movement efficiency became more apparent on challenging terrain, where minor biomechanical flaws were magnified into significant energy losses for less experienced runners. While she seemed to glide up gradients that were forcing others into hiking rather than running, by checkpoint 2 at mile 1.8, Janet had moved into the top half of the field, having passed nearly 60 Marines through consistent pacing rather than dramatic surges that might have attracted attention from race officials or spectators. Her time split suggested someone running well within their capabilities, while others were beginning to show stress fractures in their race plans as the course demands exceeded their preparation levels. Second checkpoint radio report carried more detailed information about field distribution. Lead pack reduced to 12 runners at 11 minutes 47 seconds, second group at 12:30 with 15 participants, main field showing expected spread based on course difficulty. Participant 238 moving up through field position approximately 60th overall. No pace changes noted. Colonel Davidson processed this information with growing interest as she recognized that participant 238 corresponded to Janet Holloway, the woman whose registration had created unusual circumstances. During the pre-race period, any medical concerns with our late registrant? She asked the checkpoint coordinator, who had been briefed about potential issues with older participants. Negative, ma'am. Participant appears to be managing course demands without difficulty. Steady forward progress consistent with experienced trail runners. No signs of distress or unsafe pacing decisions observed, came the reply, which contradicted the predictions that had dominated pre-race discussions about Janet's likely performance and safety requirements. The third checkpoint, positioned at mile 3, represented the most challenging section of the course, were sustained. Climbing through technical terrain eliminated participants who had overestimated their fitness levels or employed unsustainable pacing strategies. This checkpoint historically produced the highest dropout rates and required emergency assistance for Marines who pushed beyond their physiological limits in competitive situations. Captain Chun repositioned herself for observation of the third checkpoint approach, where the course's true nature would separate recreational participants from serious endurance athletes. "This is where we'll learn everything we need to know about competitive positioning," she explained to Major Walsh, who had joined her for the critical phase of race observation. Mile 3 eliminates pretenders and reveals who actually trained for mountain running. The lead pack had been reduced to 8 Marines by the time they reached checkpoint 3, with Corporal Brennan and Staff Sergeant Delgado maintaining their positions among the front runners. Despite the punishing pace that had dropped several pre-race favorites from contention, Lieutenant Morrison continued to hold position in the lead group, but was showing signs of stress as his flat road training proved inadequate for sustained mountain climbing. Behind the elite group, the main field had fragmented into individual battles against the course itself, with some Marines discovering fitness levels they hadn't known they possessed, while others learned painful lessons about the difference between base fitness standards and competitive endurance requirements. The attrition rate was within normal parameters, but the individual struggles were becoming more apparent as the demanding terrain exposed weaknesses in preparation and pacing strategy. Janet approached checkpoint 3, having advanced to 35th position overall through the same steady rhythm that had characterized her entire race performance. Her breathing remained controlled, her stride showed no signs of deterioration, and her overall presentation suggested someone who could maintain current effort levels indefinitely. Rather than racing against personal limitations, the contrast with struggling participants around her was becoming impossible to ignore. Checkpoint 3 report. All lead runners accounted for field spread, now exceeding 4 minutes participant. 2-30-8 continuing steady advance current position 35th overall. Maintaining consistent pace, no medical concerns flagged. The radio crackled with information that was beginning to attract attention from race officials who hadn't expected significant stories to emerge from the back half of the field. Colonel Davidson requested clarification about Janet's progress, as her advance through the field represented an unusual development in a competition where position changes typically occurred through other participants dropping back rather than sustained forward movement by unexpected competitors. Confirm position and pace data for participant 238, she directed while wondering if her authorization for Janet's participation was about to create publicity that extended beyond base boundaries. The response carried information that would reshape everyone's understanding of what they were witnessing on the mountain course surrounding Raven Point Marine Corps Base. The fourth checkpoint at mile 4.2 marked the beginning of the final descent, where accumulated fatigue would determine who possessed the leg strength and mental fortitude necessary to maintain pace on technical downhill terrain that punished runners whose training had focused exclusively on climbing endurance. Most participants reached this point with compromised form and depleted energy reserves, making the transition from uphill grinding to controlled downhill running a critical test of overall preparation. Captain Chun adjusted her binoculars as the lead pack approached the checkpoint with only 6 Marines remaining in contention for overall victory. Corporal Brennan continued to set the pace, but his form was showing signs of deterioration that suggested he was operating near his physiological limits. Staff Sergeant Delgado maintained second position with the disciplined pacing that had carried her through multiple competitive events, while Lieutenant Morrison held third place despite visible fatigue that made his continued presence in the lead group increasingly impressive. Lead pack through checkpoint 4 at 19 minutes 12 seconds. The radio reported to Colonel Davidson, who was now following race progress with intense personal interest. Gap to second group has extended to nearly 2 minutes. Field continues to spread with normal attrition rates for course difficulty. No medical emergencies reported, but several participants have accepted voluntary withdrawal. What made this routine checkpoint report extraordinary was the supplemental information that followed after a brief pause. Participant 238 has advanced to 8th position. Overall current split time suggests possible sub-25-minute finish if pace is maintained, requesting guidance on protocol for unexpected competitive performance by previously unranked participant. The radio transmission created immediate silence in the command tent as Colonel Davidson processed information that contradicted every assumption about Janet Holloway's capabilities and intentions. A sub-25-minute finish would place her among the fastest times ever recorded on the Semper Fi challenge course by any participant, regardless of age or gender. Such a performance would represent elite athletic achievement that belonged in regional competitions rather than base fitness events. Confirm participant identification and split times, Colonel Davidson directed while wondering if radio equipment was malfunctioning or if checkpoint personnel had misread their timing systems. Cross-reference with registration data and verify position calculations against lead field timing. The response came with the precision that characterized military communications when accuracy was essential. Participant 238 confirmed as Janet M. Holloway, retired Master Sergeant. Current split times verified through electronic timing system. Position calculated against full field including lead runners. No equipment malfunctions detected. Participant maintaining consistent pace with no signs of distress. Captain Chun lowered her binoculars and turned to Major Walsh with an expression that mixed professional vindication with genuine amazement. She's not just competitive, she's potentially going to win this entire event, Chun said while calculating pace projections based on Janet's current split times. If she can maintain current speed through the final mile, she posts a time that breaks the existing course record by a significant margin. The revelation spread through the observation areas like electrical current as Marines who had dismissed Janet as an overconfident amateur processed information that required complete reassessment of everything they thought they understood about athletic performance and competitive hierarchy. Runners who had positioned themselves as favorites found their strategies meaningless against someone whose capabilities had been hidden behind carefully managed expectations. Major Walsh grabbed his radio to coordinate with Checkpoint 4 personnel. Request visual confirmation of participant 2-30-8 single quotes S condition and pacing strategy. Directed while trying to understand how someone could advance from the back of the field to potential victory without displaying obvious signs of competitive effort. Describe running form, breathing patterns, and apparent exertion levels. The response painted a picture that defied conventional understanding of distance racing physiology. Participant appears to be running well within capacity, maintaining textbook form with controlled breathing. No signs of anaerobic stress or pace. Unsustainability. Movement efficiency suggests significant training background, possibly elite level development. At Checkpoint 4, Janet passed through the timing mat with the same composed expression she'd maintained throughout the race, but her position among the field had transformed her. From a curiosity into the dominant story of the competition, she moved past struggling Marines who had started the race with confidence in their fitness levels, only to discover that their preparation was inadequate for someone operating at an entirely different competitive level. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, who had been running near Checkpoint 4 when Janet passed through, found himself witnessing something that challenged his understanding of human athletic potential. She looks like she's on a training run. He radioed to the command station. No visible effort, no breathing distress, no form breakdown. It's like she's been holding back for 4 miles and could accelerate if she wanted. To the timing mat registered Janet's passage with electronic precision that couldn't be disputed or explained away as measurement error. Her split time of 21 minutes 18 seconds at mile 4.2 projected a finishing time that would establish a new course record while also representing one of the fastest 5-mile mountain running performances achieved by any athlete of her age in documented competition. Colonel Davidson realized that her decision to authorize Janet's participation had created a situation that would attract attention far beyond Raven Point Marine Corps Base. Prepare media coordination protocols. She directed her staff while recognizing that Janet's performance would generate questions about Marine Corps fitness, standards, competitive policies, and the evaluation criteria used to assess participant qualifications. Final mile of the Semper Fi challenge course featured technical downhill running that required different muscle groups and mental approaches than the climbing sections that had dominated the middle miles. Many participants who survived the uphill grinding discovered that their quadriceps and stabilizing muscles were unprepared for controlled descending at race pace, creating opportunities for position changes based on specific training weaknesses. Captain Chun repositioned herself for observation of the final approach where Janet's true competitive intentions would become apparent. This is where we learn whether she's been racing conservatively or if she's been holding back enough capacity to actually accelerate when it matters most. Chun explained while tracking Janet's progress through the technical terrain. The lead runners were beginning to show signs of accumulated fatigue as they navigated rocky sections and exposed routes that demanded concentration and energy reserves that had been depleted through 4 miles of aggressive racing. Corporal Brennan's form was deteriorating enough to affect his efficiency, while Staff Sergeant Delgado was maintaining position through discipline and experience rather than remaining physical reserves. Janet approached the technical descent section with unchanged rhythm and apparent energy reserves that suggested she could maintain current pace indefinitely or potentially increase her speed if competitive circumstances required additional effort. Her movement through challenging terrain displayed the kind of technical skill that developed through years of specific training rather than casual recreational running. She's gaining ground on the lead pack, Captain Chun observed through her binoculars as Janet's consistent pacing began to close the gap with Marines who had started the race as heavy favorites. The leaders are slowing due to fatigue while she's maintaining the same rhythm she's used throughout the entire race. The radio crackled with an update that sent shockwaves through the observation areas. Participant 238 has moved into 5th position overall and is continuing to advance gap to lead runner, now less than 30 seconds with approximately half-mile remaining projected finish time under 24 minutes, which would establish new course record. Colonel Davidson stood in stunned silence as she processed the implications of what was unfolding on her base. A quiet woman in borrowed-looking running gear was not only competing against elite Marines, but was positioned to defeat them decisively while establishing performance standards that would redefine expectations for future competitions. The pre-race concerns about her safety and qualifications had been replaced by questions about how such extraordinary capability had remained hidden until race conditions revealed its true extent as Janet's extraordinary performance became undeniable. Colonel Davidson initiated immediate research into her background through military personnel databases and competitive athletics records. What emerged within minutes of database queries painted a picture that explained everything while simultaneously raising questions about how someone with such credentials had been dismissed as an amateur by trained Marines who prided themselves on recognizing excellence when they encountered it. Master Sergeant Janet M. Holloway's service record revealed 22 years of distinguished military career that included 3 combat deployments and assignment to elite reconnaissance units where physical fitness wasn't just encouraged but required for survival. Her military occupational specialty had been force reconnaissance, which demanded fitness standards that exceeded normal Marine Corps requirements and included advanced training in mountain warfare, navigation, and endurance operations in challenging environments. But her military service represented only one aspect of a competitive athletic background that extended far beyond what anyone at Raven Point had imagined. Janet had competed at the collegiate level in cross-country and track events before enlisting, earning All-American honors in distance running that qualified her for national championship competitions. Her transition from civilian athletics to military service had enhanced rather than diminished her capabilities, as military training provided structure and discipline that elevated her natural talent to elite performance levels. The database revealed competitive achievements that would have been impressive for athletes half her age, including multiple Marine Corps marathon victories in her age group. Boston Marathon qualification times achieved consistently over a 15-year period, and course records at military installations across the United States that remained unbroken years after her retirement. Her marathon personal best of 2 hours 43 minutes represented world-class performance that placed her among the fastest female distance runners in military history. How did we miss this? Major Walsh asked Captain Chun while reviewing Janet's competitive resume on a tablet that displayed achievement after achievement spanning 2 decades of excellence. Her running credentials read like a professional athlete's career summary, yet she walked onto our base looking like someone's aunt who got lost during a family visit. Chun studied the documentation with professional appreciation for athletic longevity that defied convention understanding about aging and performance decline. This explains the biomechanical efficiency I observed during her warm-up, she said while cross-referencing Janet's times against current competitive standards. She's not just a former athlete maintaining fitness, she's an active competitor who has continued training at elite levels throughout her military career and into retirement. Colonel Davidson discovered additional context that provided insight into Janet's mysterious presence at Raven Point and her enigmatic responses to questions about her background. The previous year, she had been recruited by the Marine Corps Marathon organization to serve as a pace leader for elite female participants, but had declined the invitation, preferring to compete independently rather than assume coaching responsibilities that might compromise her own competitive goals. More significantly, Janet had been conducting informal evaluations of military fitness programs at various installations as part of a Pentagon initiative to improve training standards across all branches of service. Her presence at Raven Point wasn't coincidental but represented official research into competitive athletics programs and their effectiveness in maintaining long-term fitness among military personnel. Her authorization from Colonel Davidson reflected not personal favor but professional recognition of her credentials and mission requirements. She's been observing our training protocols and competitive standards as part of a broader assessment program, Colonel Davidson explained to her staff while processing implications that extended beyond the current race. Her participation wasn't about personal achievement. It was about evaluating whether our programs produce athletes capable of competing at levels that matter for military readiness and performance under stress. The revelation recontextualized every interaction Janet had experienced since arriving at the base, from Sergeant Thorne's safety concerns to the dismissive comments from competitive Marines who had assumed her presence represented overconfidence rather than professional evaluation. Her calm responses to skepticism and refusal to provide detailed explanations about her qualifications reflected someone conducting research rather than seeking validation from people whose fitness standards she was assessing. Janet's military decorations included recognition for physical fitness excellence that went beyond routine awards to acknowledge exceptional performance in demanding circumstances. She had received the Navy and Marine Corps' Achievement Medal specifically for athletic achievement that brought positive attention to Marine Corps' competitive programs and demonstrated the kind of individual excellence that enhanced institutional reputation. Her post-retirement activities included coaching youth athletics programs and conducting workshops for military spouses about maintaining fitness during deployment separations, but she had maintained her own competitive training with the dedication that characterized elite athletes who viewed running as fundamental to their identity rather than casual recreation. Her current fitness level represented the culmination of 3 decades of consistent training at levels that most recreational athletes never approached. Look at her training logs from the past year, Captain Chen said, while accessing performance data that Janet had submitted as part of her evaluation credentials. She's been averaging 70 miles per week with tempo runs that would challenge collegiate athletes and long runs that exceed what most people cover in a month. Her fitness isn't declining with age. It's being refined through intelligent training and competitive experience. The research revealed that Janet's marathon certificate discovered in her equipment bag represented just one recent achievement in a competitive schedule that included trail running championships, mountain running events, and multi-sport competitions that tested endurance across various disciplines. Her sub-3-hour marathon time wasn't an isolated achievement, but reflected consistent performance at levels that qualified her for elite competitive fields. Major Walsh discovered competition reports that described Janet's racing strategy and mental approach to challenging events. Multiple sources describe her as someone who races the course rather than the field. He read aloud, "She's known for conservative early pacing that allows her to maintain speed when others fade, and for mental toughness that enables her to perform when physical discomfort becomes a factor." The documentation explained why Janet had positioned herself at the back of the starting field and maintained consistent effort rather than engaging in early pace competition that might have revealed her capabilities prematurely. Her racing philosophy emphasized energy conservation and tactical patience over aggressive positioning that could compromise performance during critical phases of competition. Colonel Davidson realized that Janet's performance would generate attention that extended beyond Raven Point to Marine Corps headquarters and potentially to civilian athletics organizations that tracked military competitive achievements. We need to coordinate with public affairs about media requests, she directed while recognizing that Janet's story would appeal to audiences interested in both military excellence and inspirational athletics. Database research also revealed why Janet had been reluctant to discuss her background with Marines who questioned her presence. Elite athletes often preferred to avoid expectations and pressure that could affect their mental preparation and competitive focus. Her evasive responses reflected professional maturity rather than uncertainty about her capabilities. She's been evaluating us while we've been underestimating her, Captain Chen observed with professional admiration for Janet's approach to what had become an inadvertent demonstration of the gap between appearance and capability. This entire situation has been a case study in assumption versus evidence, and we've all learned something about the dangers of judging athletic potential based on superficial observation as the final mile unfolded. Janet's advance through the field continued with relentless precision that reflected decades of competitive experience applied to course management and tactical racing. Her performance was revealing itself as not just individual excellence, but as a measurement standard that would influence how future competitions were organized and evaluated at military installations across the service. Final quarter mile of the Semper Fi challenge transformed from athletic competition into living demonstration of principles that would reshape how every witness understood the relationship between appearance assumption and authentic capability. Janet had closed the gap to the lead runners and was now positioned just 15 seconds behind Corporal Brennan, who was struggling to maintain pace that had seemed sustainable during the early miles when adrenaline and competitive confidence masked the accumulating physiological debt of aggressive racing strategy. Captain Chun observed the unfolding drama through binoculars while providing commentary that would help other Marines understand what they were witnessing. This is what tactical racing looks like when executed by someone with decades of competitive experience, she explained to the growing crowd of observers who had gathered to watch an outcome that defied every prediction made during pre-race analysis. She's been managing her energy expenditure with precision that allowed her to maintain capacity for exactly this moment. The lesson was becoming clear to everyone who had participated in the dismissive conversations about Janet's qualifications and likely performance. Their assumptions had been based on visual cues that bore no relationship to actual fitness levels or competitive capability. Worse, their certainty about her limitations had prevented them from recognizing obvious signs of athletic excellence that Captain Shun had identified through trained observation and professional knowledge. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez arrived at the finish line area after completing his own race in what he considered a respectable time until he learned that Janet was positioned to break the course record by a significant margin. "I was running beside her at mile 2, he told anyone who would listen. "She looked like she was out for a casual jog while I was already working hard to maintain pace. I thought she was being foolish about energy management, but she was actually demonstrating textbook pacing strategy." Sergeant Thorne found himself reconsidering every aspect of his pre-race intervention and the safety concerns that had prompted his attempt to dissuade Janet from participating. His professional judgment had been based on assumptions about age and appearance that proved completely irrelevant to actual performance capability. The liability issues he'd worried about were non-existent, while the embarrassment factor had shifted to the Marines, who had dismissed elite talent without conducting proper evaluation. "I've been coordinating fitness events for 15 years, Thorne admitted to Colonel Davidson while watching Janet's relentless approach toward the finish line. "I thought I could assess participant capabilities through visual observation and standard protocols, but I've never encountered someone whose appearance was so completely disconnected from their actual fitness level. This experience is going to change how I evaluate participant qualifications." Lieutenant Morrison, who had managed to maintain his position in the top 5 despite the punishing pace, was learning painful lessons about the difference between training hard and training intelligently. His aggressive early pace had seemed tactically sound when he believed he was competing against Marines with similar fitness levels, but Janet's sustained advance demonstrated superior race management that couldn't be matched through determination alone. She's been racing the course while we've been racing each other, Morrison realized, while struggling through the final elevation changes that Janet was navigating with unchanged rhythm. Every decision she made from starting position to pacing strategy was based on understanding course demands rather than responding to competitive pressure from other participants. The approaching finish created anticipation that extended beyond typical race excitement as Marines gathered to witness something that would become part of base folklore for years to come. Janet's performance represented more than individual athletic achievement. It demonstrated principles about judgment, preparation, and authentic capability that had implications for military leadership and personal development. Throughout their careers, Colonel Davidson prepared remarks for the post-race ceremony that would acknowledge not just Janet's performance but the learning opportunity her presence had created for everyone involved. Today we've received instruction about the dangers of superficial assessment and the importance of looking deeper than initial impressions. She planned to tell the assembled Marines, excellence often presents itself quietly, and our assumptions can blind us to capability that exists right in front of us. Captain Chun recognized that Janet's race would become a case study in sports, psychology, and competitive athletics that she would reference in future training programs. The mental discipline required to maintain tactical patience while being dismissed and questioned demonstrates elite-level competitive maturity. She explained to Major Walsh, who was documenting the event for official records. She executed a perfect race plan despite psychological pressure that would have disrupted most athletes. The final 100 meters revealed Janet's true competitive nature as she moved alongside Corporal Brennan, who was visibly struggling to maintain pace that had carried him through 4 3/4 miles of challenging terrain. Janet's breathing remained controlled, her stride showed no signs of deterioration, and her facial expression suggested someone who could accelerate further if circumstances required additional speed. Brennan glanced sideways at Janet as she drew even with his position, and later described the moment as both humbling and educational. She looked like she could run another 5 miles at the same pace. He would tell fellow Marines, while I was operating at my absolute limit, she was demonstrating that there were levels of fitness and race management that I hadn't even known existed. The crowd gathering at the finish line included Marines who had witnessed Janet's pre-race treatment and were now experiencing collective recognition that their judgment had been fundamentally flawed, not through malicious intent, but through reliance on assumptions that proved worthless when tested against actual performance. Their embarrassment was overshadowed by appreciation for instruction they hadn't known they needed. This is going to change how I evaluate people in all situations, not just athletics, Staff Sergeant Delgado admitted while watching Janet's approach toward a finish that would establish new standards for the competition. I thought I understood what serious runners looked like and how they prepared for events, but my assumptions were limiting my ability to recognize excellence when it appeared in unexpected packaging. The final 50 meters showcased Janet's tactical brilliance as she had managed her energy reserves to maintain kick capability that allowed her to take the lead during the most critical phase of the race. Brennan's early aggression had left him without additional gears, while Janet's conservative approach preserved the speed necessary to win when it mattered most. She's been in control of this race since mile 1, Captain Chun observed as Janet moved into first position with smooth acceleration that demonstrated fitness reserves that none of the younger Marines possessed. Everything we've witnessed has been execution of a race plan developed through decades of competitive experience applied to course analysis and tactical patience. The lesson extended beyond athletics into leadership. Principles about the importance of substance over appearance, strategic thinking over aggressive tactics, and long-term preparation over short-term intensity. Janet's performance provided instruction about authentic capability that would influence How these Marines approached evaluation and assessment throughout their military careers, as Janet approached the timing mat that would record her historic performance. The assembled crowd of Marines stood in respectful silence, recognizing that they were witnessing something that transcended typical competitive achievement. They were observing demonstration of principles about judgment, capability, and authentic excellence that would remain relevant long after her finishing time was recorded. In base archives, Janet crossed the finish line with the same composed expression she had maintained throughout the morning, but the electronic timing display that flashed her official result created immediate silence among the assembled Marines, who struggled to process what they had witnessed. 23 minutes and 47 seconds represented not just a new course record, but a performance that shattered previous standards by over 2 minutes, establishing a benchmark that would stand as testament to authentic excellence disguised as ordinary presence. The timing officials verified their equipment twice before announcing the result, officially recognizing that Janet's performance would generate scrutiny from competitive athletics organizations and military fitness commands, who tracked records across all installations. Her time placed her among the fastest mountain runners in military history, regardless of age category, while simultaneously demonstrating that elite capability could remain hidden until circumstances required its revelation. Colonel Davidson approached Janet at the finish line with the kind of respect reserved for exceptional achievement that reflected positively on institutional standards. Master Sergeant Holloway, on behalf of Raven Point Marine Corps Base, I want to express appreciation for your demonstration of Marine Corps excellence, she said while extending her hand in recognition of performance that would become part of base history. Your participation has provided education that extends far beyond athletics. Janet accepted the acknowledgement with characteristic humility that had defined her interactions throughout the morning. Thank you, Colonel, but the real value comes from what everyone learned about assumptions and authentic capability, she replied while removing her timing chip with movements that suggested someone accustomed to post-race protocols. Sometimes the most important lessons come from situations that challenge our comfortable certainties. The post-race ceremony took on significance that transcended typical award presentations, as Marines gathered to witness formal recognition of achievement that had redefined their understanding of competitive excellence and personal evaluation. Captain Chen presented analysis of Janet's race strategy that would be incorporated into training programs designed to teach tactical racing and energy management to future competitors. Master Sergeant Holloway executed textbook race management that demonstrated principles every competitive athlete should understand. Chun explained to the assembled crowd, she raced the course rather than the field, maintained energy reserves for critical phases, and managed psychological pressure that would have disrupted less experienced competitors. Her performance provides instruction about strategic thinking that applies to military operations as well as athletic competition. Sergeant Thorne approached Janet with genuine appreciation for lessons learned through his pre-race intervention that had seemed professionally appropriate at the time, but proved embarrassingly misguided when tested against actual capability. Ma'am, I owe you an apology for questioning your qualifications, he said, with the directness that characterized military acknowledgement of error. Your patience with my concerns demonstrated professionalism that I should have recognized as indication of your experience level. Janet's response reflected understanding that Thorne's actions had been motivated by genuine concern rather than malicious intent. Sergeant, your job is protecting participant safety, and your questions were reasonable based on available information, she said with grace that made the learning experience positive rather than punitive. The important thing is that everyone learned something valuable about evaluation and authentic capability. The ripple effects of Janet's performance began immediately as Marines throughout the base shared the story with colleagues who hadn't witnessed the race directly. Her achievement became part of installation folklore that would influence how future generations of Marines approached assessment and assumption making. In both professional and personal contexts, the lesson about looking deeper than surface appearances gained power through dramatic demonstration rather than theoretical instruction. Lieutenant Morrison, who had finished fourth despite his aggressive early pace, approached Janet with questions about training philosophy and race strategy that would influence his future competitive preparation. "Ma'am, would you be willing to share advice about developing the kind of tactical patience you demonstrated today?" he asked with genuine interest in learning from someone whose expertise had been proven under competitive pressure. "The most important lesson is that racing is problem-solving under physical stress," Janet explained while engaging with young Marines who sought guidance from her demonstration of excellence. "Every decision from pacing to positioning should be based on course analysis rather than emotional response to what other competitors are doing. Tactical thinking produces better results than aggressive reaction." Staff Sergeant Rodriguez found himself reconsidering not just his athletic training, but his approach to leadership evaluation throughout his military career. "Your performance today changed how I think about recognizing capability in all situations," he told Janet during the informal discussion period that followed the ceremony. "I realized that my assumptions were limiting my ability to identify excellence when it didn't match my expectations." Captain Chun documented Janet's race as a case study that would be presented at military fitness conferences and civilian athletic symposiums, where her story would illustrate principles about competitive psychology and the dangers of superficial assessment. Her performance provided quantifiable evidence that expertise often presents itself quietly, while amateur enthusiasm tends to announce itself loudly. The base newsletter featured Janet's achievement prominently, with analysis that connected her performance to broader themes about military excellence and the importance of looking beyond surface indicators when evaluating capability and potential. Her story became required reading for leadership development programs that emphasized the value of thorough assessment over quick judgment. Colonel Davidson received inquiries from other installations requesting information about Janet's training, background, and availability for consulting assignments that would help improve competitive athletics programs. Throughout the Marine Corps, her performance had demonstrated standards that other bases wanted to understand and potentially replicate. Through improved training protocols and participant evaluation methods, Janet's departure from Raven Point occurred with the same quiet dignity that had characterized her arrival, but the impact of her presence would influence base culture for years to come. Marines who had witnessed her performance would carry lessons about assumption evaluation and authentic excellence throughout their careers, applying insights gained through dramatic demonstration to situations far removed from competitive athletics. The official race results were distributed, with Janet's time highlighted prominently alongside acknowledgement that her performance had established new standards for the competition while providing educational value that extended beyond individual achievement. Her story became part of Marine Corps' athletics history while simultaneously serving as instruction about the importance of looking deeper than initial impressions. 2 weeks later, Janet received formal invitation from Marine Corps Marathon headquarters to serve as elite pace leader for the following year's competition, along with requests for interviews from military publications interested in her perspective on fitness training and competitive excellence. Her response maintained the same humility that had defined her presence at Raven Point, while accepting opportunities to share knowledge gained through decades of disciplined preparation. The Semper Fi challenge course record established by Janet would stand for years as testament to what could be accomplished through intelligent training, strategic racing, and the kind of mental discipline that allowed someone to perform at elite levels while being dismissed by observers who confused appearance with capability. Her 23-minute, 47-second performance became the standard against which future participants measured their own achievements. Marines throughout Raven Point continued discussing Janet's race months after the event, recognizing that they had witnessed something that transcended athletics to provide instruction about judgment assessment and the recognition of authentic excellence in all its forms. her story became part of their shared experience, influencing how they approached evaluation in professional military contexts, as well as personal relationships. Lesson that excellence often presents itself quietly while seeking no external validation would remain relevant throughout their careers as these Marines encountered situations where surface indicators provided incomplete or misleading information about actual capability and potential. Janet Holloway's performance at the Semper Fi challenge had provided demonstration that would influence their decision-making. Long after her finishing time faded from immediate memory, have you ever made assumptions about someone's capabilities only to be completely proven wrong by their actual performance? What would you have thought if you had seen Janet warming up at that starting line? Tell us in the comments about a time when someone surprised you with abilities you never expected. If this story reminded you that real excellence doesn't always announce itself, hit that subscribe button and share this with someone who knows that true champions often look nothing like what we expect. More stories about quiet heroes who shatter expectations are waiting. Click the next video and discover another reminder that extraordinary people walk among us every day, usually without fanfare or recognition, until the moment when their authentic capability becomes impossible to ignore. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.